closely related to his interest in the historical research, which in part focused on the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. The presentation is entitled Mercury and Gemini Recovery. He's going to give us a look at the design evolution of Mercury and Gemini spacecraft as it relates to recovery, information on squadrons and types of helicopters involved, and a look at the history, colors, and markings of several of the recovery helicopters. David, if you would.
Thank you. Well, as the introduction noted, I was born and raised here in San Diego, and one of my early memories was getting up at 4:30 in the morning when I was 8 years old and going and looking at our black and white television and watching John Glenn not take off. And every time there was going to be, his launch was scheduled, I would get up and watch that. I've been interested in the space program since I was a little kid. I did not do any work as an adult in the aerospace industry. I did live theater, I built scenery, and did technical work like that. So my dad, however, he worked over at the Naval Air Rework facility in North Island all of his adult life. And every summer we would go over when they had their open house, and as a kid I remember looking at all the tools and all the stuff. He was a machinist over there. So my interest in aviation really sprang from that initially. So what I do want to talk about today a little bit is some information about Mercury and Gemini, and some of the things that happened in the evolution of the design, especially of the Mercury spacecraft, that affected things that happened later in its operation, and also to one specific person who was Gus Grissom. So let me dive right in. I want to go, this is a diagram of the Mercury spacecraft. Most of you are familiar with its shape. I don't know how many of you are familiar with kind of what's going on here as far as its structure and stuff. It basically consists of a pressurized, let me see if this will work. I can't see. A pressurized crew cabin, which is right in here, that was made out of titanium. And on the outside of that, it had hatch section stringers, and then all of the thermal shielding for it was put on the outside of that. So when you look at a Mercury spacecraft, you basically are looking at its thermal control things and not the thing that structurally held it together. The other thing is this is the forward portion of the vehicle according to NASA, because it basically in orbit, they orientated it to fly in that direction with the heat shield pointed in the direction of flight. So this is the aft end over here. Of course, when it's on any of its launch vehicles, it's 180 degrees from that when it's sitting there. All of the systems that were needed to run the spacecraft and keep the astronaut alive were contained within this pressure vessel, with the exception of the fuel tanks for the attitude control system, which was put on the outside and put in this area between where the heat shield is and where the crew cabin actually starts on the back. So it's all very compact. They built and designed all this, of course, to orbit the Earth. Its design life was for 3 orbits, and that was their main thing, is can we keep this system running for 3 times around the Earth, and then hopefully at the end of that time we'll bring the astronaut back and we'll move on from there. Now they did happen to fly some of these for a longer period than that, but it was because it was not designed for really any length in space. They had a real hard time upgrading the systems from the point of view of maintaining for any length of time. Gordon Cooper flew 22 orbits in this thing, and at the end of his flight, all of his systems, for the most part, had failed, with the exception of what was keeping him alive. But all the stuff that had to do with attitude control and all the automatic parts of the vehicle had basically failed. And he manually flew a re-entry and landed about 2 or 2.5 miles from his impact point, and he did all of that manually, and that's flying at over 17,000 miles an hour when he was in orbit. So I mean, he was lucky and skilled enough to be able to do that and to be able to survive a trip in space that the vehicle was really never designed to do.
Did they anticipate that? In other words, did they plan 22 orbits and then he had to fly manually home? Or
They did plan for 22 orbits for his flight, but they upgraded the system to the point where they thought that it would sustain for that amount of time.
But it did.
But a lot of the systems went in, it simply did not last for that length of time. Reliability back in this time was a real concern, and many times things would not last for what they had hoped from a design point of view. One of the things that I want to talk about a little bit is this thing right here. When this vehicle was designed, this is the side entrance hatch for the Mercury spacecraft. And this is how an astronaut or an occupant would be inserted into the vehicles through this hatch. The initial design of this vehicle happened before the type of person who was going to fly in it had been determined. So they did not know at that time that an active test pilot was going to be the occupant of the vehicle. Not so much because of that, but they thought it was simply going to be an occupant, and they didn't know where they were going to get these people from. So, they could have been gymnasts, they could have been custodians, they could have been any number of different things, and it was actually Eisenhower who basically drove the idea of using active test pilots from the military to be the people that would be chosen. So this hatch initially was designed to simply allow the pad crew to get the occupant into the vehicle. And after that was done, the pressure portion of the hatch was bolted on, and then the hatch section stringers that went across that were bolted on, and then the outer shingles were placed over the top of that, and they were then bolted on. And so an occupant in the original design could not get out through this hatch. So they had a separate way of allowing egress out of the vehicle, and that's in the front part of the pressure vessel. They built a hatch into that. And that hatch, the occupant could get to. He would remove this portion of the instrument panel. That was removable. He could move that to the side. He could crawl up around in here, open the hatch, push out the extra parachute in the recovery. So there was 2 parachutes for redundancy, the one that was used and then a second one that was exactly the same. He could push that out, and then he could go up through this part and exit. When the astronauts were announced and these test pilots got involved, one of the very first things they did is they said, we want another way to get out. It was imperative to them to have a second way to get out, and of course, the only thing that worked in that is to then change the design of the hatch area and make that something that could be done. The other main thing that they wanted, in the original version, there was a porthole window down in here and another one up over here. And when you sat in the vehicle, you really couldn't see anything outside. And the initial from NASA, it was like, we're not even sure that this man's going to survive in space. I mean, let alone give him, let's say, a window to look out. They wanted a window. And so later on in the development of the spacecraft, they put a window up in the top here that allowed the astronaut to look out. The first 8 of 20 of these that were built had portholes in them. And then after that, as these things went down the assembly line, then they finally put the window in for the last vehicles that were built.
It was a window with a mirror. They had installed a mirror so he could also see through that window.
Yeah.
It was not aligned so that he could look through his helmet and look out at the same time.
Well, he could, depending upon the orientation of the vehicle, he could look out through that center overhead window.
Okay.
3 different types of hatches were designed for this vehicle. This is the first one here. Now this is Mercury Redstone 1A, which is the first launch of a Mercury spacecraft on a Redstone booster. And this was unmanned, simply a test to make sure that the spacecraft and the booster were compatible in actual flight. This is the outer heat shield. These are individual sections, panels of this corrugated metal which is bolted onto the outside. To get it off, you had to take each one of those out. You can see the hatch section stringers, they needed to be unbolted, and then all of the rest of the bolts needed to be taken out. And this hatch flew, pretty much any time that the vehicle was unmanned, they just flew this hatch, because that was the original design. There was no reason to change it in this situation. They then went because of basically what the astronauts had asked for two different other types of hatches. And one was flown twice operationally, and that was on MR2 and MR3. MR2 was Ham's flight, and MR3 was Alan Shepard, the first astronaut. And that was this large latched hatch. It weighed about a little under 70 pounds. It had mechanical latches in it. It could be opened from either the outside or the inside of the vehicle, and therefore allowed the occupant to be able to open that hatch and not have to crawl up through the top, because otherwise you would have had to crawl up through the top and come out that way to get out. Yeah.
Are you saying that when you sat in the capsule was actually, from your orientation, was going backwards?
When you're on the booster, according to NASA it is,
Yeah.
but you're also sitting in the position you need to sit in to take the acceleration loads that are happening in the flight.
Right.
That's basically why you're seated in that position.
But you're seated looking at the small end of the capsule.
You're seated facing forward so that as the thing goes up into space, you are pressed down into the couch through the G's that you're pulling.
And then in orbit, do you turn it around?
They turned it around and basically pointed it what they consider front and forward.
Right.
So he was basically facing, looking where he had gone, not looking where he was going. Now, this is a purely ballistic vehicle.
Right.
It had no computerized control other than what was happening on the Earth. Once it got into orbit, he could not change that orbit at all. He could change his orientation of the spacecraft within the orbit, but all that orbit was determined by how well the booster did its job to put him into orbit.
But then he would orient again backwards to enter the Earth's atmosphere.
Basically, they kept it with the blunt end forward as much as they could, and that was in case something
Right.
untoward happened.
Right.
It was not something where he had to go through a lot of gyrations to put it into the position close to where it needed to.
On
So it could
separation
re-enter.
from his booster, it automatically turned around.
Oh, it did? Yeah.
And then orbited all the time with the blunt end first.
Blunt end first, yeah.
Yeah, and this was because the vehicle was originally designed to be flown, of course, without anybody in it. Because they were going to test it, they tested it in space that way, and so it had to have all this automatic control. And of course, another thing that the astronauts ended up doing is they wanted a manual control as well. And that happened throughout the progress of the evolution of the design, is that they got the ability to control the vehicle as well.
Which was a good thing.
Question?
On the final versions of these, of the Mercury, did they ever practice the alternate emergency egress? And were they ever successful in that?
They practiced it quite a bit. And one of the reasons they practiced it, because if they had re-entered from orbit in an emergency situation where they were not landing in a designated landing area, and perhaps it would be they land in the jungle or somewhere else in the ocean where there wasn't recovery forces right nearby, then they wanted them to know that they could get out. So if they were in the water, the way for them to get out would be to go up through the top. And that's because of something I'll talk about in a minute that's going on in regards to that. They did not want them to come out through the side hatch unless they would have landed on the land.
Okay.
And in that case, they could do
Did
that.
they design it so they could, my understanding was that these things came down so fast that if they landed on land, there'd be injury to the astronaut.
There's possibility of that. They didn't do any human testing of that from the point of view of putting an occupant in one of these and dropping them with a parachute on the land. They kind of felt that it was, with the amount of ocean surface, the vast majority of that orbit is over the water. So they basically felt that their situation of landing on land was pretty remote, actually.
Listen, I want to add that they did land one as far as 250 miles off target. Landing target.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that there was a lot of manipulation to find out how well the astronaut could control the vehicle once he got into space.
Sure.
It wasn't just go into space, turn it around, and
Absolutely.
let the attitude stay there.
Right.
They were very busy. Are you gonna cover the escape door for Gus Grissom?
Yeah.
Okay.
The third kind of hatch is what was called the orbital hatch. And they basically went back to the original design. They changed how the shingles were put on the outside of it. They reduced them in size a little bit. And then they put pyrotechnic bolts in all of these 70 places where there's a bolt that holds that inner pressure hatch and those hatch section stringers on. And then they ran then a train of pyrotechnics through that and allowed a manipulation from either the outside or the inside to fire that train and bust all those bolts, and it would pop that hatch off.
Blow the door off.
They had to do that because the weight of this hatch was about 23 pounds, and they felt that the 70-pound hatch, they really didn't have, they felt that if they did that as far as orbital flight goes, they were getting real close to what that Atlas could do, and with keeping the whole weight of the vehicle in orbit. They were right on the edge as far as where their weight was and what an Atlas without an upper stage could basically put into orbit. Yeah.
Did they make a smaller version and put Ham, the chimpanzee, in it and test it? I didn't know they tested it with the chimpanzee.
Ham and Enos were the two chip flights. They both rode in their own self-contained atmospheric. It was their Ham flew suborbital and Enos flew orbital. So before they put a man in it, they made sure that they did a chimpanzee test.
And it was the same size capsule, right?
The capsule itself was the same. They modified where the astronaut sat to allow them to put a chimpanzee in there.
I guess in the earlier ones, he put up 2 rhesus monkeys.
That's a test, that's a Little Joe test with an
orbital
prototype capsule,
Yeah,
and they did do that.
before NASA took over the space program, the Army sent up 2 rhesus monkeys, Abel and Baker. But it was an Army experiment. And then when NASA took over, they said none of the military is going to be involved in space effort, and they weren't. Nearly part of the program. So those 2 flights weren't even considered as part of the program for Mercury.
It's interesting, the conversation you were talking about when they added the window and the flight controls, and apparently the astronauts almost mutinously went to NASA and said, "We are not monkeys, we are test pilots, we want a window, and we want flight controls."
Right. They had a big say, and that was intentional too. When they finally decided that they were going to put test pilots in the astronaut corps, NASA embraced that and wanted their input. So they also wanted engineers, So Gus Grissom was one who actually had an engineering degree. He had an aeronautical engineering degree and also a mechanical engineering degree. So they valued their input from that point of view. One of the downsides of that, which simply is because they came in and said, hey, what about this change, what about that change? It sort of stretched out the program a little bit longer than what was intended originally because of the changes that were.
It was the statement, spam in a can.
Yeah.
They didn't want to be just a person. They wanted to have the ability to influence their environment
Right.
and their control.
And Chuck Yeager, of course, is the person who coined that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
He said all they were was spam in the can.
Yes.
During, I believe, the first flight, when he was coming down, they left some kind of straps on the outside to hold something on because they weren't.
I'll talk about that in a minute. I'll talk about that in a minute. I will talk about that in a minute. This is the initial egress out of the vehicle. This is how the astronauts were going to get out. There was going to be inflation balloons put at the aft end of the vehicle that would keep it so that the nose of the vehicle was kept above the water, and then in an emergency situation where there was a recovery nearby, they could then go out through the top, put their little life raft out, and get out of the vehicle. One of the problems with re-entry in this situation, because the vehicle is so small, the heat pulse that's happening during re-entry basically did, to some degree, soak through into the vehicle. So they wanted to keep the temperature in the vehicle right around 78 degrees or so. By the time this vehicle re-entered in any situation, whether a man was in it or not, the temperature inside would get up to about 120 degrees. And so it wouldn't stay there for very long, but still, once they put a man in it, they said, look, we've got to have something that allows him to be able to get out. And in this situation, he could not get out of the side of the vehicle because this is with the initial hatch, which the only way you could open that was from the outside, and you had to have screwdrivers. There's simply no way to take that thing off without that. Now, one of the things that happened in regards to this is this section this is called the recovery section of the vehicle here at the aft. This cylindrical section had aluminum panels on it, and they had little doors in 4 positions to allow these bags to pop out after they were inflated. The Big Joe mission, which was the first time that a Mercury shape was put on an Atlas, and that was done in about, I think, September of '59, they found out that the heating during re-entry on this part of the vehicle was much higher than they had anticipated. They could not use aluminum there. They had to go to beryllium shingles over this area. And when they did that, they eliminated this thing that would allow the capsule to float nose out when it hit the water. This thing was the worst boat ever designed. And they knew that. They realized that. So they went to an alternate way to try to keep the vehicle afloat upright, so in case the guy wanted to get out, there was a possibility to do that. And how they did that was they made the heat shield, the main heat shield, detachable from the end of the vehicle. And they put a bag or a skirt between that with holes in it. That would drop down while the thing was on its main parachute. It would fill with air. When it hit the water, that air would expel. It would slow down that initial deceleration. And the other thing it would do, it would fill with water and act as a sea anchor. And it was something that had to happen because they could no longer put floats at the top of it. There simply was no way that they could change that part of the design and put those there. However, the downside of this is the heat shield is now no longer permanently attached to the vehicle. And that became a problem during John Glenn's flight when they got an erroneous signal back at Mission Control that his heat shield was loose while he was in orbit. They didn't tell John this at all. They did ask him if he heard any bumping and thumping going on that was different from what he should be expecting, and he started to figure out that something was going on and he wasn't being told. The retro pack, which is this thing right here, this is the propulsion system that allows you to decelerate and come back from orbit. It has 3 straps on it that go up around this heat shield and attach to the support ring right at the back of the conical section of the vehicle. So what they said for John is they said, instead of doing an automatic re-entry where you push the button and after all the retros fire, this retro pack will be jettisoned, is we want you to now do it manually, fire when you need to at the time is right, but don't jettison the pack. And of course he asked, what's the reason for this? And they said, well, Cape Flight will tell you.
I know you're probably going to get to this, but did it float on its own, the capsule?
Yes, it was buoyant.
So it didn't need extra...
Not really, but what would happen is it would, if it did not have this bag, it would basically float on its side.
It was a seasick generator.
And it was, yeah, it was extremely, I mean, because it is so small, it's like putting a cork in the water and watch the cork go. So, the whole thing about how do you respond to that, if you at all have any kind of, lots of astronauts throughout Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo had an issue with this when they got in the water because these things were extremely unstable. They were buoyant, but they were unstable.
So because of the air inside the capsule kept it afloat.
No, the rolling,
yeah.
It's the rolling that made them ill.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the choke.
So because of the fact that John Glenn had this thing on the back side of his vehicle where all the heat pulse is going to be dissipated from, he undershot his reentry by about 40 miles. And at the time that happened, because he was so far from the prime recovery ship, a destroyer, the Noah, is the ship that actually ended up picking him up. And because of that, there were no helicopters really involved in his recovery because the helicopters didn't have the range to go out to where his re-entry ended up happening. This is a photograph of a test. This is Scott Carpenter practicing getting out through what I will call the top of the vehicle. All of the astronauts did this kind of testing, to make sure that they could get out. Scott was the only one who felt comfortable at all doing this. He was extremely fit and extremely thin. He was a gymnast when he was growing up and when he was in college and stuff, and his ability to go up and do the things that he needed to do to get out, he really didn't have a problem. He ended up being the only astronaut operationally to come out through the nose of the vehicle. And that's because when he landed, he was 250 miles overshoot from where he was supposed to land. And there were reasons for that were partially his fault and partially NASA's, and of course NASA decided after that in their infinite wisdom to say, Scott, you screwed it.
Yeah.
And it was like, it wasn't totally his fault, but, those things kind of happen in that way. So that's Marine Helicopter Transport Squad 262. These guys were earmarked by the Department of Defense and by NASA, basically NASA going to the Department of Defense and saying, we plan to land this capsule in the water. They went and got this particular helicopter, this transport helicopter squadron, and volunteers out of this squadron trained to pick up these capsules. This started in 1959. It started actually before the astronauts, or right around the time the astronauts were actually selected and announced as being something that was going to happen. All of the testing that happened with the Little Joe and all the pre-testing that happened, these guys were involved in picking those capsules out of the water and also doing all kinds of other sim tests to find out how do we pick this capsule up and what are we going to do? What's going to be the process that's going to go through? So these guys, you will see this marking on all these helicopters that are in the early part of Mercury because this was the squadron that was earmarked to do that. So on a manned mission, what would happen is these guys would get vetted out to whatever the prime recovery ship was. They would do the recovery, and then the helicopters that were involved in the Navy would support.
Let me, can I interject something here?
Yeah.
I was involved with that very early on in 1957-58 out of Eglin Air Force Base, which is on the Gulf of Mexico. And we were doing kind of like a dropout test from a C-119 at about 10 or 12,000 feet, dropping in the Gulf. And these folks were, after that, they were testing stability, how well that thing deploy its chute, how well it rolls when it gets in the water, all of those kind of things. So that was 57, 58.
So even earlier than that then?
Yeah, no, they were not.
No, was that squadron involved? Do you remember if that squadron, that Marine squadron?
Only those that were in, but there were none of these, and I was looking at your dates. All of those dates had to do with rocket assist, getting it up.
Yeah.
What I was involved with was starting at 10 or 12,000 feet, pushing out of the back of a boxcar.
Yeah.
A little different classification, but still was studying this Mercury capsule.
Right.
That was the first I had heard of this thing when I got involved with that program.
Well, there's a lot that I'm not talking about here because the program is small, it's just huge, when you look at
I
it.
feel excluded.
No, I don't mean to do that.
No, it's okay.
That was intentional,
Thank you very much, I appreciate that.
So this is a photographic representation of what ended up being the process that the recovery helicopter was going to go through to pick up an astronaut. And so the vehicle is re-entered, is sitting in the water. They would come down. Now, these H-34s could barely pick this weight up of this vehicle because as this thing is developing, it's getting heavier and heavier. And they were right at the limit of what they could pick up. In fact, they had to take these helicopters and basically clean everything out of them. All of the extra seats, all of the extra equipment that was installed in these utility helicopters, and also one of the crew members. They normally flew with 3 for Lou's recoveries. They only flew with 2. They only flew with a pilot and a co-pilot, and the co-pilot then doubled up as the cargo chief as well. So when you see a guy down here who's got what's called a shepherd's crook and he's going to hook onto the recovery loop here, that's the co-pilot. He's tasked with doing that for these recoveries. So they're gonna come in, they're gonna attach the end of the hoist loop onto the thing. Prior to doing that, they have to cut off the communication antenna, which is I don't know, I think it was about 14, 15 feet long, and they didn't want it to get fouled up in the bottom of the helicopter and all that kind of stuff, so they snipped that thing off. Then they come out and hook, which is what you see here. You see the co-pilot hooking on the end of the hoist loop so they can take the capsule and pull it out of the water a little bit, so it's stable. And then they're in communication with the astronaut. When they get all that done, they tell them to deal with your hatch in whichever way, whatever kind of hatch you had. In the case of Shepard, on the first mission, he had a hatch that he could simply unlatch, and he dropped it into the water. With Grissom, he had an explosive hatch, and we'll talk about that in a minute. After the thing was stabilized, they drop a horse collar down, and then pick up the astronaut and pull him up. They were concerned because of the weight of the capsule. It weighed over,
Around 3,000 pounds.
it was a little less than 3,000 pounds. And what they didn't want to do was have the astronaut, initially they were going to simply leave the astronaut in the capsule, pick the whole thing up, gently set him down on the recovery ship, and then move on from there. But they were concerned that if they had any issue with the helicopter, since it's a one-engine vehicle, that they wanted him to be in a position where if the helicopter had to let go of the capsule, there wasn't a person in it at that time.
Just out of curiosity, since they only had a two-man crew, were either one of them trained as a rescue swimmer?
No. Now, there was some, but not specifically. What happened with the astronauts is they were trained. They were trained in that situation, and they were trained by the underwater demolition community. But there were, on these early missions, there were no swimmers in the water at that time for the recovery itself. But they were trained. So this photograph was taken probably sometime either summer or a little earlier, 59. This includes all 7 of the original Mercury astronauts, and then UDU number 2 unit, some of the members that helped train these guys to be familiar. This man right here, this is Deke Slayton. He was one of the original 7. He could not swim prior to being announced as an astronaut. He didn't have any swim lessons prior to that. And he nutted it up and learned enough to be able to go in the water and feel comfortable enough, because there was the big concern with this is if they landed off course, they landed somewhere where recovery was not nearby. They needed to be able to survive in the water. They could not really, they felt that it would be really tough if they had to stay in the capsule for that kind of thing. After Gus Grissom's flight, now Gus flew the second suborbital flight, he had an orbital capsule, and they wanted to man-rate this capsule for what was coming up in the orbital flight. So he had the window in the center, and he had an explosible orbital hatch. When his spacecraft re-entered after this 15 minutes of orbital flight, he called to the helicopter and said, okay, I'm almost ready. Let me fill out some information on a little cheat sheet here about what my instruments are saying. He pulled the plunger cover off of the plunger. That would be the thing that he could activate the explosive hatch with, and he pulled the cotter pin out of it as well. Sometime after that, the hatch blew. Before the helicopter had latched on, and water immediately started pouring in, and he, thank God, prior to that, had taken his straps off, his restraining straps, and so he got out. He got out. If you watch film of it, you can see that he's getting out right now, because his capsule's starting to fill with water. Now the crew in the helicopter knew that they were trained by these guys to be comfortable in the water. They saw him, they thought, okay, he's probably okay, we're going to try to save the helicopter. So they didn't immediately go after him, they went after the helicopter. I'm sorry, they went after the capsule. And they hooked onto it, they tried to lift it out of the water. It had so much water in it that they could not get enough of that excess water out to be able to lift it up comfortably. They had a warning light on their instrument panel that said that there was
all red.
That there was metal shards in the oil, which ended up being not true.
Yeah.
But because of that, they finally cut the capsule and let it go. Meanwhile, Gus is in the water. because of the speed of him getting out, he did not close his neck down, and he did not close his inlet to his oxygen. So his suit was filling with water, and he was less and less capable of maintaining his head above, and was wondering why he wasn't being picked up.
There's one other element there. He had his pockets in his leg filled
He had
with
full
rolls of dimes.
Dimes, right.
Yeah.
Mercury dimes, too.
Mercury, hey, they were dimes, went into space, he was gonna make a fortune.
Yeah,
Well, he thought he was
yeah,
anyway.
that was true. That was part of it.
One of the other things that came out when they were investigating, they only recovered the capsule like 2 years ago, I think it was.
Oh, a little further back than
So-
that,
so
but
it was a
yeah.
little more than that.
Yeah.
But at any rate, none of the telemetry ever showed that he manually activated that hatch. So they still
there
don't
was
know why
no
it fired.
telemetry of that per se. Now, they looked at the physical, the hatch itself, of course, they did not recover.
Yeah.
The thing about Gus Grissom is, there's all this talk about, did Gus panic and blow his hatch? And of course, to me, the answer to that is no, he did not. And the reason I say that, if NASA had kind of gotten to the conclusion that he had done it through something that was going on with him as far as panic and stuff, he never would have been the prime pilot on the first Gemini mission,
Yeah.
or the prime pilot on the first Apollo mission.
Nope.
And so they pretty much, they agreed with everyone else who said, look, this was not an issue where he did something wrong. And they were kind of anal about that in essence. If they found things where someone was doing something that wasn't correct, in a lot of cases, they wouldn't fly again. And Scott Carpenter is a prime example of that.
Yeah.
Because of his overshoot on his reentry in his Mercury flight. Basically, Chris Kraft said, never again, this guy's not flying for us. And it was like, and there was some personality issues going on there between the two of them as well, which is all, when you read any of the biographies from some of these different personalities, you kind of read between the lines and you see some of that.
Same thing
But-
happened to Wally Schirra from Apollo 7.
Wally decided that he was going to be somewhat dictatorial about how he was responding to
That's
mission
why he
control.
never
But prior to that, he had said, I'm retiring after this mission. So and things had been happening to him that he felt that mission control and some of the other processes that were involved in planning weren't treating him properly. One of that was with the Apollo spacecraft, it was felt you could not land that thing on the land and have the crew survive. And they launched that Apollo 7 with the winds blowing in such a way, if he had to abort very early in the launch trajectory, that would have blown that thing back over the land. And he knew that. And he was not happy about that. And some of that is what showed when he ended up saying to Mission Control, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
Because they did not want to hear that kind of stuff.
He also at that point had a cold.
They all had a cold.
And
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
the sinus pressure and
Yeah.
stuff, so he was not happy.
He was, yeah, absolutely. So this is early in the process. This is what happens when your landing bag gets ripped off the bottom of your spacecraft. This is Ham's vehicle. There is no more landing bag. The sea state had fatigued the supports and the attachments for that and ripped the bottom of the heat shield is gone. So this is a stable Mercury capsule with nothing on it to create any kind of buoyancy to get the nose up out of the water. Also, he was, they think in the process of having that thing rip off, probably the edge of the heat shield punctured the back of his pressure bulkhead. So he was Ham was getting a little water, not inside where he was in the capsule, but within the capsule. So his was an overshoot as well. The crew that finally ended up picking him up, they said he was about probably an hour and a half away from sinking. So they did go in and make the recovery. You can see the bottom of it. He should have a landing bag here. That is not there. The MR1 has no landing bag. There's no occupants in it, no human or animal occupants, so they're not concerned about it at that time. Yes?
Did they just hook one line onto the capsule?
They hook the main hoist pickup. And what you see here, this is what's called the shepherd's crook. This is the device that the co-pilot uses to put the hook of that onto the onto the recovery loop of the vehicle. Now, in that case, it's also had a trigger on it. You could trigger and a little squid would fire here and actually break the handle off, and he didn't fire.
So that wasn't manually done in that case? A person didn't go down and hook it on?
A person in the helicopter hooked it on,
Oh, so.
in all cases.
Right, oh, okay. So the second thing you were talking about there was,
What this thing is, it's hanging off the side. That's part of the mechanism that the co-pilot uses to hook the hook of the hoist line onto the capsule. And they simply didn't. He simply, like what I said, is it has a squib on the end of it, and he can actuate that squib and break the handle away from this long. It's about 12-foot long handle, and just break it away.
I see.
And he hadn't fired that for whatever reason.
You got away from it. You're more likely.
Easily done.
So this is a look at what these recovery helicopters look like. When I first did this presentation, my focus was on these helicopters. What did they look like? Why is there not a lot of information? Now, this comes from my modeling background and interested in what did they look like, and why is there nothing out there in the way of decals and stuff to reproduce these particular vehicles. So I initially did my research about the vehicles, and all this other stuff came basically later. So that's...
It's interesting, just from my perspective, to see that they didn't have pontoons.
Well, what if it's too heavy?
Well, yeah, I hear you, but it's, you know,
The other thing that I found...
To me, that they, you know, that they couldn't actually sit down.
In the water.
I mean, they're over the water, you know, they have...
For short periods of time, they...
I mean, it would just seem, I mean, you know, if I'm doing that, I'd like to have the pontoons.
The Sea King is right on the horizon here.
Yeah, okay, sure.
Which, one of the things that happened here is when this all started, again, this goes back to 59 and 58 timeframe.
Right.
This was the vehicle of choice for the light squadrons to be flying. And the reason they picked a marine utility one was because it didn't have extra equipment in it. They could not use CBATs, which is the anti-submarine version of this that the Navy was using, because of all the sonar stuff in it. And if they were going to use those, they would have to taken all of that equipment out every time that they were going to do recovery. And the Navy at that time kind of said, I don't think we're really ready to do that. So the Army, they also went to the Army and said, what do you have in the way of assets that we could use to make this recovery? And the Army basically said, we don't have any experience over the water. So we're kind of going to say maybe this shouldn't happen from a training point of view for our guys. And the Marines were finally the ones who said, yeah, we got people that do this.
They looked at the Mojave, but it was just too big.
Yeah, the problem with the Mojave is getting it, maintaining it on the carriers and maintaining more than 2 or 3 or 4 of them at a time. That was really...
What size engine is that? Is that R2800 or?
I believe so. I believe it
Single
is.
stage?
No, it's an 1820.
1820?
Is it 1820?
So did you?
Your basic B-17 engine.
Yeah.
They went to the jets a little later on for more power.
So this is Grissom's, Gus is this little dot right here, this little white dot. That's his head. The water you can see pouring out of the hatch sill as they try to lift this thing up out of the water. And again, as I said before, here's the prime recovery ship. He's landed reasonably close to where the ship is. There's 2 other helicopters in the area, the one that's taking the photograph, which is a Navy helicopter, and then the second or secondary recovery helicopter, which is part of this squadron. And he's kind of sitting over here. And once this finishes and he cuts us loose, then he swoops down and he gets Grissom and picks him up.
Dave, real quick, and Dudley, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but take a look at the picture of that rotor on that one photo.
Back? You want to go back?
It was,
Oh, yeah.
it was
Oh,
like
he's training like crazy. He's
Yeah.
training like crazy to get him up. So here's Gus on the end of his horse collar.
Wow.
Gus is looking a little damp at this time.
A little damp.
Yeah, a little wrinkled at this time, probably. What they say about Gus is, one of the things about Gus that I've read is that he was very honest. And he said, it's not that I'm terrified, it's that I'm apprehensive. And a lot of these guys, of course, wouldn't even say that. You know, that's not a macho thing. We're not going to say that. Gus was the kind of guy who would say, "Look, this is a dangerous thing we're doing here. I understand that, and I'm gonna vocalize that to some extent. But like I said, because he went on and did these other things in the program before he was killed, you know, he was considered, if he would have lived, if he would have survived, and let's say the Apollo thing kind of happened as it did, he was slated to be the first guy to walk on the moon. At least Deke Slayton would have done everything he could to get, because Deke wanted one of the original 7s to be the first. This is a little bit about Scott Carpenter's Mercury orbital flight. There are some times you read and you said after the early things, the Marines were not aboard. This is from a film, 16 millimeter film that I've cropped it down. These guys were on the deck of the carrier waiting to go when he had done his retrofire, and in about 20 minutes of time he was going to be landed. So they were ready. This is the 3. There's a primary, secondary, and then a third guy. They were ready to go. The other thing that's on the deck of the carrier in this particular thing is the first active anti-submarine squadron in the Atlantic to fly the Sea King. Carpenter lands 250 miles long, and the Air Force drops pararescue men with flotation. What happened after Grissom's thing is all of a sudden NASA said, we better make a flotation collar, something we can put around the capsule, and we're also going to get crews in the water as soon as we can around this capsule. Because he landed so far away from, Carpenter landed so far away from the recovery helicopter, Air Force pararescue men dropped into the water, went over, put a flotation collar around his capsule, stayed with him, but he had already gotten out through the top at that time. And the Air Force then said to the Navy, we've got an Albatross, we're ready to pick him up. And the Navy said, no, you will not be doing that. What we will do instead is we will get a couple of these guys and take him out there and pick him up with our assets. And after all this happened, there was a little bit of a push and a shove going on, because basically the Navy kind of should have said, yeah, you know, but they made up this thing about how you're out, you know, your airplane's going to fall apart in the water and blah blah blah. I mean, it was just excuses that you could tell when you read them was just, come on. Now I'm not a Navy or an Air Force guy or any of those. Like I said, I did theater. So when I read that kind of thing, it's like, you know, if you've got assets that are in the area and they say they can go do the job, you'd kind of think you would say, yeah, go do the job. But the Navy was not happy about it.
Albatross was not happy with heavy seas.
Then that could have been part of the thing. Yes?
During this presentation, you've been talking about the inaccuracies of the astronauts hitting the water in the correct location.
Yeah.
That I was unaware of. Did they ever ascertain why that was occurring?
Yeah. Most of it had to do with the fact that they are flying at 17,000 miles an hour, and in the case of the automatic systems that are in the spacecraft to make sure that at the proper time the retro rockets fire, in the case of Carpenter's overshoot, he was misaligned. His spacecraft was not aligned in the orbital path. He was about 20 degrees off. So when his retro rockets fired, instead of getting 100% of that retro thrust, he was getting less than that. And he also was 2 seconds late because he had to do it manually.
That's what I was getting at. Was the
2 seconds.
astronaut's problem, or was it the system's problem?
A little bit of both.
Oh,
One of the problems is he had a yaw problem. And one of the things they said about when you were flying in these things, you could tell your pitch, you could tell your roll. It was very hard to tell if you were off in yaw. It was very hard to tell. So he had a sensor that failed on his vehicle when his yaw sensor failed. And it told him you were straight up and down and he was 20 degrees off.
17,000 miles an hour is 5 miles a second, so it doesn't.
So there's not a lot of room there. And these are ballistic, these are ballistic capsules. They are center weighted. So you cannot, they're not offset weighted capsules where you could take and turn them a little bit this way and a little bit that way and then change that reentry trajectory a little bit. Wherever these things fired, that distance from that to landing, that was gonna happen no matter what. Now, Glenn's undershoot was because they had left this retro pack on.
If you look at it, at the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs overall, they were pretty much on target.
Yeah.
That's why.
Well, the thing is, as you get out.
250 was the furthest.
Yeah,
And
right.
going to the moon, Moore tells a story about Apollo 8 almost hitting their recovery ship.
Yeah, right, and that's, you know, the way that all of this happened gets much more sophisticated as these programs move on. And a lot of this stuff then goes away from the point of view of these kinds of problems. And also in the Geminis and the Apollos, they've got a form of computer on board that assists them in making sure that they can land where they want to, because their center of gravities are offset.
That's why I brought it up, because I remembered later in the project, they were pretty darn accurate. So I wondered what was going wrong at the beginning.
Well, first time. That's a big thing that was going on. We're learning how to do this.
Yeah, except this is just aerodynamics, so.
Well, yeah.
No,
More than aerodynamics,
it's orbital
the weight
mechanics,
factor.
it's a whole different
I
thing.
give a lecture downstairs on
Like
the
a
Apollo
pilot.
as to how they can fly that beautiful cone shape. They can fly just like an aircraft. They have all the attitude controls because of the weight asymmetry on it.
Right.
And get right there on the target.
Right.
Yeah, they
And
have
this
control.
vehicle did not.
And they did not
Did not
have
have
it on
that.
this, yeah.
Well, the other thing too, Gene Kranz wrote in his book that even when they were doing the first Apollo shots, they were learning about orbital mechanics. Because they found out that they were doing maneuvers with Apollo that they thought would do one thing, and it did a different thing because just the way the orbit worked, gravity was tricking them every time. And then later on in the program, they were dead accurate.
The last two Mercury missions were longer duration, and they both landed in the Pacific Ocean. And that has to do with the amount of time, you know, even though they're launching early on the East Coast, they only have a certain amount of time, and each one of these orbits is about a little over 90 minutes thereabouts. So as they fly longer and longer, they end up moving more and more west to land when they're done with their missions. Also, the last two missions in Mercury, both these Schirra and Cooper landed spot on, as did the first two flights, the suborbital flights. So it's really only right in the middle there where the position. So because they're landing in the Pacific now, the Atlantic Marine Squadron is now no longer involved in the things. And these are photographs from Schirra's recovery, and these guys are from the Greyhawks, which is HMR 161, based up out of let's see, there I go. Not El Toro, but what was the helicopter facility up in
Tustin?
Santa Ana, Tustin.
Santa Ana in Santa Ana.
No, Santa Ana and Tustin.
Yeah.
Tustin, right?
Yeah.
Right in there, yeah. That's where these guys were based and so they trained they also, what happened now is NASA is asking UDT personnel to be trained to go into the water. And that's what you see happening. You see UDT guys on the outside that have put these collars on. Some of that training happened here because these UDT guys are coming out of San Diego. This is a photograph out of the Flickr page here at this fine museum. When I looked at this image, I looked at this and I said, oh, look, somebody's doing some training with a Mercury spacecraft. This is probably Coronado. I'm not sure if the golf course is in yet. I don't know when it was put in. We're probably north of the amphib base, or a little bit north, a little bit northwest, somewhere in there. So we're in that bite of water that's between the amphib base and Coronado. And this is Fleet Angels. So they're simply using them as training these UDT guys, and that's probably what this photograph is. I'm pretty sure this is San Diego. This image is not captioned.
We can see the bridge.
That's a Silver Strand, there's Glorieta Bay, there's a bridge.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, it's there.
The bridge wasn't built till '69. But I'm pretty sure this is San Diego, even though this image has not been identified. It's taken with an instrument camera too.
There's a bridge, yeah.
glass lens.
And that is Silver Strand by Glorieta Bay.
So when they went to Gemini, the second space program after Mercury was Apollo, from a design point of view. Gemini was added after the fact. And now they flew second operationally, but they weren't designed, because their design came right out of McDonald's and said, we want to build a better Mercury spacecraft. Apollo starts right after Mercury is designed. The design for Apollo begins. And if you look closely at the Apollo spacecraft, especially the command module, it is very much the older cousin, I should say the younger cousin of a Mercury spacecraft. They are almost identical in the design things that happen in those two vehicles. Whereas this one's a little different. All of the equipment, other than what's needed to show them on their instruments what's going on, but most of the equipment is now put on the outside of the pressure vessel. And that's not true of Apollo. Everything's put inside, just like Mercury. And to work on that, then you have to get inside the crew cabin to work on stuff. And that's one of the things that slowed down the development of that program. So you only put 2 guys or 3 guys in there at a time to put things in and work on stuff. Here you can work on the outside of the vehicle. All the equipment is modularized at this time, so you plug things in, unplug them, and that's kind of did not happen with Apollo, and certainly didn't happen with anything that was going on with Mercury. It's a much larger vehicle. All your propulsion and a lot of the life support is in the back here. That's where all your fuel and stuff is. This vehicle has the ability to now do a little more flying in space. And of course, the reason they did this is they wanted 2 major goals to be met. And one was what happens when you get out of the spacecraft and try to do useful work. And the other was to rendezvous and dock with another vehicle. Because by this time, they know that that's the method they're going to use to go to the moon. And of course, they have no experience doing that. So that's one of the main reasons why this is designed.
And also proved that man could stay in space for 2 weeks.
Yes, you're right.
So to that point, what was the time, in your estimate, what was the time that they locked down the entire procedure for going to the moon? In the sense of the LEM, 3 astronauts, 1 orbiting, 2 going on the LEM, you know, that whole...
It was officially announced in July of '62.
Oh.
July of '62 then.
It was officially announced.
Yeah.
So everybody knew we had to be able to do these docking maneuvers, the LEM flight, the reconnection, the ascent, descent engines, all of that.
So those decisions were made prior to that announcement, pretty much. Now, there was a famous thing where Kennedy was down at, John Kennedy was down at Cape Canaveral. No, I think he was at, he was probably at Huntsville. And they were doing a briefing and stuff, and Jerome Wiesner, his science advisor, was with him. And they started talking about all this lunar orbit rendezvous stuff, and the guy got up and said, we're not going that way. And this was in a public meeting and stuff, and this is his science advisor saying that. So there was a huge part of the community that was still voting against this method of having this rendezvous happen around the moon at a time period where we hadn't rendezvoused anything anywhere at all.
Which is why Gemini started in 1964 to prove that we could.
Right. And and the other thing is these vehicles are designed by aeronautical engineers. They want to land on the Earth. They don't want to land in the water. It costs them a lot of money to land in the water. Now, it's an easy, quick way to get the capsule back because of the amount of water that's around the Earth. But this kind of thing even happened in Mercury, where they looked at these situations. Can we use one of these Regalo wings and land these things on the Earth? And the Gemini was actually designed to do that. The problem with that is that the contract for this went to North American Aviation to develop this part of the system for Gemini. All of North American Aviation's prime engineers were working on Apollo.
That's right.
So they kind of got the second and third tier guys working on this. And so it never really worked out. But
we were working on that, on the Apollo 3-man configuration in early 1959.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it goes way back. Yeah.
Yes.
However, didn't the Russians land on?
They landed on soil.
Soil.
Pretty much exclusively.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, early on, what they did is they ejected the in an ejection seat for the Vostok stuff.
Right.
The cosmonaut was ejected out. That's why most of their early cosmonauts were basically parachutists.
The other
Still
thing,
military, but
Yeah.
the other thing about the Russians is they developed a cargo drop where they could load heavy pallets, drop them from their logistics aircraft, and then about 3 meters off the ground, they fire a retro rocket that slows them down.
Right.
That's what they used on every one of their space capsules.
yeah, their Soyuz still re-enters in that way. And then they use these rockets to slow down that final bit of descent onto the Earth. So this was not used in Gemini. However, the spacecraft was set up to have this happen. You know, the bays for the skis and stuff were built into the vehicle, and all of that kind of stuff stayed. Now, of course, the skis themselves were never put on any operational vehicles, but they did a lot of testing too out at Edwards of these types of things. So instead, they went to water landing again. Because there's 2 crew members and they sort of sit side by side, instead of splashing down, landing on your heat shield, then they took and turned the thing a little bit sideways and then landed on the bottom side of the spacecraft into the water. Similar though to Mercury in that it only has a single parachute, has a drogue, and then a single parachute is pulled, and has a second parachute as a backup in case the first one fails. Of course, this stuff here that's going on, the recovery part with these collars and stuff are all done now in all cases. And that's to keep the vehicle afloat and keep it somewhat stable while they go
Were
together.
those integral to the spacecraft, or did they have to have the rescue swimmers attached to those collars?
Rescue swimmers had to attach these collars. Yeah. What I find interesting for me about this is that now when Gemini starts operationally, what happens here? This is early in '65. We now move over to anti-submarine squadrons doing all of the recovery now from this point basically forward through all of Apollo as well. And they're all using some form, either an A or a D model, usually Sea King helicopter. In this case, this is the very first Gemini that was recovered, unmanned. This was a test flight. For the manned missions, what would happen to the helicopters? These were all operationally anti-submarine helicopters, and so all the sonar and stuff was taken out of the two to three, sometimes it was 3 helicopters that were scheduled to be the pickup helicopters. And they would pull all that equipment out, and of course, then after that was all done, they put it all back in, and these guys would go back and do their regular thing, which is hunt submarines.
What kind of engines did they have? Were those like jet engines? Or-
This is a turbo jet, dual engine helicopter. They could not pick up the weight of the Gemini vehicle, but they were used exclusively as far as pickup crews and doing all that work. What would happen with the crews is the crews could decide whether or not they wanted to get out of the spacecraft at recovery, or they wanted to stay in the spacecraft and wait for the ship to come by and then get craned up onto the ship. So that's one of the things that happened. Now, as I went through and was looking at all these helicopters, and I'll just show you some of this. That's a great one. Where's the image is broken. Thanks a lot. This is GT3. It was picked up, again, by these Sea King helicopters. The one that I found interesting was Gemini Titan IV. This is the helicopter that picked up the Gemini 4 crew, which is the first time we did a spacewalk. So this is Ed White and McDivitt. James McDivitt. In the process of doing this, I'm finding out what the bureau numbers and stuff of the helicopter is, because for me that was important at the time. I got an email from some guy up in, I shouldn't say some guy, he was a docent up at the U.S. Hornet Museum, and he said, I think we have a helicopter, one of our helicopters here was used in a Gemini recovery. Can you help me to see whether that's true or not? And of course I went back and said, well, if you can tell me what his bureau number was, then I can go and look and see whether there's some possibility that you might have something there with that. The helicopter that they had was used in the filming of the movie Apollo 13. And it had, they had gotten it out of I don't know the name of the facility down in Tucson where all, you know, a lot of
FEMA.
yeah, well, they had gotten a helicopter that the Navy simply had gone in and said, here's the one you can have. Now, at that time, they made it, they refurbished this helicopter and made it flyable for the movie. And then after that, they actually put it back into the boneyard for a little bit, and then the Hornet kind of said, we want a helicopter, which one can we have? And they said, well, this one's in reasonably good shape, because we just refurbished it, you can have that one. So they got it out and they took it up, and it's 148999, and that's its number. And that happens to be the same number as the helicopter that recovered the Gemini 4. At the time of that, they didn't know that they had a Gemini recovery helicopter. Now, I've gone through all the helicopters for recovery for all of these early missions, all the way up through the end of Apollo. None of the Apollo helicopters were ever put in any museums. But out of all of these, and none of the Mercury stuff was ever put in any museums. In fact, the one that picked up Shepard, which would be the one I would think would be, you know, maybe the Smithsonian would say we might want that. That ended up being sent to Thailand. It got sold to Thailand, and then they used it up, basically used it up, and it got scrapped, and, you know, it's gone. And I don't know if that's true of any of the other ones, but I do know that out of all of the helicopters that picked up Gemini crews, 3 of them are in museums today. And at the time I was doing this research, which was early this century, none of these guys knew that they had recovery helicopters from anything having to do with space-related stuff. So I would email these guys and say, I think you've got a recovery. What is the bureau number? You know, what does your card look like? What is, because each of them have that, what's the name of the card? I don't know, the card that goes with the vehicle. And they would write back and say, yeah, on such and such a day, it was on that ship, and then it's like, well, there's, you know, I can't tell you, you know, 100%, but I pretty much bet that unless they were mismarked in some way, that you've got something there that I think is valuable in a way a little different than what its use was at the time that it was retired, because in all 3 of these cases, of course, these helicopters went on to very active lives in the United States Navy, basically, and were used in many different ways. This one on the Hornet is still marked as it was when it was repainted for the movie, for the Apollo 13 movie. But it was interesting to go through and talk to some of these people and say, you know, do you have something here that is, you know, that has a little more history to it than maybe what you know?
Could that land on the water?
For short periods, yes.
Yeah, what I have read is that it kind of could, but they really said, no, you better not. What would happen to the helicopter after it landed in the water was, yeah, it was a little top heavy, because the engines and stuff, of course, are up in here, and, you know, it's sitting down here. So they said it was kind of unstable, and also what needed to happen to the helicopter after it got immersed in the seawater, that all needed, all that, you know, all that thing that happens with seawater touching the metal needed to be dealt with.
Yes.
So they could, but they basically said, if you absolutely have to, then you do. But you don't do it just because you think it's good. Hey, let's go do this.
I did see one of them, we were over in the IO, and we have one of these delivering mails to us, and he lost his tail rotor, the transmission went. So she started to go like this, and God knows who the pilot was, but I think he had wings himself. But he got her off the starboard side of the ship and put it down in the water, and she stayed there for about 3.5 minutes, and then 1,000 fathoms.
Well, also there is one helicopter that picked up 5 Apollo crews. And of course it was based HS-4 out of Black Knights down Greenfield. And the Smithsonian went to the Navy and said, when you retire that helicopter, you know, we do definitely want that helicopter. And unfortunately that helicopter crashed right here off, you know, within 30 miles of the coast here. It was
doing a training and stuff, anti-submarine training, and the engine failed. It failed to the point where I think one crewman died and 2 others were severely injured in the thing. And of course, it went into the water and sunk, and so that thing is gone. Based upon what I have read about it, is they don't even think, it's been too long now to think that there would be much left of it. I don't know that that's true or not.
Yeah.
I mean, I hear all the time that they're finding World War II airplanes that are in saltwater immersion.
Covered with barnacles, covered with coil,
Yeah.
and corroded all the hell and gun.
Yeah, so nobody has ever put the funding together to really go look. They know where it is, you know, they know the coordinates of where it is, but apparently they haven't, no one's ever put the cash on the table.
So you're talking about all the primary recovery task forces. So the question is, how many task forces did they have for each mission? And did they plan for somebody landing way off, like 1,000 miles away?
Well, here's an example of one of the things that happened. They basically had one primary recovery area and then 2 to 3 alternate recovery areas. And the type of assets that would be involved in the secondary recovery areas were, of course, not as extensive as what was in the prime. The prime area usually would consist of a prime recovery ship, usually either a anti-submarine Essex class carrier back in this day, or a helicopter assault ship.
LPH.
Yeah, would be used as well. Those were basically what was available.
Well,
In the secondary things, it would be mainly destroyers.
Well, they had HC-130s. HC-130s have that big hump on the top, the long-range antenna.
Yeah.
And I flew, so we had a tracking device that was designed for Apollo.
Right.
So they'd be able to find it if it was 1,000 miles away.
Right.
And then drop pararescue guys
Right.
to the guys on the
So
ground.
Yes.
So they had other facilities on
So a
board.
classic example of what happened in this is that Gemini 8, which Neil Armstrong commanded, they had an issue up in space where they had a stuck thruster and was stuck in the on position. And for him to recover to the point where he could come back, he had to use his reentry maneuvering systems to reorient his spacecraft and keep it from tumbling. And when he turned that system on, the mission rule was you must land. Because he used over 70% of his reentry fuel in being able to stabilize his, and so he knew that his mission was done. This was right after they had rendezvoused and docked with the Agena. And they ended up landing about 600 miles east of Okinawa. And they were in a secondary recovery area, but because because the reentry had to happen so quickly, they were not able to say, we can extend a little longer here and get you a little closer to the ship. And the ship that they, which I don't remember the name of it again, it was a destroyer, was the ship in that area that would have picked them up, and did ultimately pick them up, but because they were so far away from the ship, they used U.S. Air Force pararescue, based upon what you're talking about. You know, they knew where it was that they landed, and so they dropped these guys into the water.
So they had assets available. In case
So they were available, you know, and they either came out of Japan, or they came out of Guam, or they came out of somewhere.
Probably Okinawa. That's where there was a rescue unit in Okinawa.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one that had Neil Armstrong on it.
That was Neil, yeah, that was Neil's flight, right. So the rest of this is basically just, so here's the second helicopter that somebody has in their museum. This helicopter, now the first one's on a Hornet. This one's up at the Seattle Museum of Flight. This helicopter, at the end of its life, looked like this. When this thing was retired, this was at Whibley Island. It got retired, and the Navy immediately said, when it was retired, you guys can have this helicopter. You know, this did search and rescue, it did all kinds of stuff up there for the main part of its life. And again, this is 2006 when this particular helicopter was retired. It went directly to that museum. I'm sorry, that's the wrong museum. It went to the Evergreen Museum in Oregon. Yeah, and that's where it went. So I happened to know at that time who some of the people that were working up there, and I emailed them and said, is the bureau number of your aircraft, and fill in the blank, whatever it is, and they said, yeah, it is, why do you ask? I said, you have a Gemini recovery helicopter. And they said, oh, that's really cool. You know, we just painted it to look like
66.
66. What else would you want to paint it? And it's like, so this is, you know, this is the helicopter on display.
It's got an Apollo on it.
Yeah, you know, this is one thing they could not do, but it's a museum, you know. They're a little, not all museums are this way, but maybe they're a little fast and loose with, you know, some of the things that could really happen. So they painted theirs as 66.
They didn't get the bureau number.
It's on display if you want to go see one, you know.
They didn't
How
get
did
the
you
bureau
paint
number
your
on it.
helicopter?
They didn't have the bureau number on it.
They initially had the bureau number on it 466, and the Navy saw photographs of that and said, you have changed that
Yes.
to the bureau number of the actual helicopter.
Yeah.
So they are,
Still belongs to them, that's right.
they don't, there's no slack there from that, from
Yeah.
their point of view. This is the only Gemini helicopter to pick up 2 crews. Okay, same helicopter. We're nearing the end of the program. What's happening now is penny pinching is going on. It's always going on in these kinds of situations. This particular helicopter picked up Gemini 10 crew and also the Gemini 11 crew. I don't know where it is today.
But for clarification, after Mercury, Gemini and Apollo were picked up by ships. In other words, a ship came by and grabbed it.
As far as the capsule itself, yes,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
So
None of these
there were 2
helicopters
heavy.
could lift
Got it,
that kind of
got
weight.
it. Okay.
Yeah.
I got it.
And in most cases, for Apollo, all of the crews got out of the helicopter,
Right.
got picked up by a helicopter, and was transported. For Gemini, that was based upon whatever the commander of the mission, the lead astronaut, wanted to do. Wally Schirra's mission, which was GT6, he was a good friend of Gus Grissom, and he said, Gus had such a problem, I'm not getting out of this thing. So they'd open the hatch after the flotation collar was on to get some of the heat out, and then he said, no, the ship's gonna pick me up. And he did the same thing for his Mercury flight, you know, he did not want to get out, because the risk involved is greater than I think you imagine it would be. It's certainly high, because I don't really, you know, I don't know what this experience is like.
Also getting back in the Gemini.
Well, it was much easier to get in and out
We had
because of
one
the
astronaut who actually had grown in height, and when he got in after the spacewalk, could not get the door closed, and they worked well over an hour
Yeah.
trying to get that, you know,
Yeah.
what's your option?
That was GT9.
Yeah.
That was Gene Cernan. He almost didn't make it back.
Yes.
Always in space.
This is the last of the recoveries. This machine is back in the American Helicopter Museum in Westchester, PA. And it had been modified to a ground attack version in the Vietnam. And of course, they do not want to change that, and rightfully so. It had an illustrious career as it was. But again, I contacted these guys, and I actually contacted this particular guy. He was a docent there. He was a volunteer, and when I emailed him, he said, you know, I think we do have a recovery helicopter. We're looking at whether or not there is anything that can verify that. And then he said, I've seen some things on the internet where this guy, I don't know who he is, has done all these helicopter markings, and he's got that number on there. Well, that guy was me. So I couldn't verify anything for him, because I can't tell you 100% that what the information I'm giving is true. I don't know. You know, it's based upon my research and looking at photographs and reading what I can about him. I said, you've got the aircraft card. What's it say? And he goes, yeah, it puts it on the ship at that time. I go, yeah, pretty much. He sent me this photograph of the helicopter sometime during that time frame. So they were actively looking as to whether or not they had a recovery helicopter. So this is the third one. It's kind of unusual that out of all these helicopters I looked at, which all through Apollo and all that stuff, there's 3, and they're all out of the same program. And yes.
I mean, I'm not the social media, you know, extravaganza giant, but you know, obviously a lot of these guys in the UDT squadrons and in the helicopter squadrons are still alive.
Yes.
And Mercury.
Yep.
And I don't know, is that part of the way that you try to figure this out?
That's pretty much exclusively
Okay.
how I'm figuring this out for the
Yeah.
most part. I found some names yesterday of some UDT guys and also some of the crew for early Mercury. I knew that Coots was, he was in charge of all that early Mercury stuff from the squadron's point of view. I finally found some of his crew members' names. And then and then what some of these guys are doing is they're posting local newspaper articles from the time, finally. Because it's stuff that, yeah, I could probably, if I had the time to do it, go to libraries and try to ferret that stuff out. But these guys are, looking at somebody's cut it out because, the hometown guy flew on this recovery thing. And that's how I'm finding this stuff out. I look at blog sites and all this stuff where anything that I can search through and find names and get ideas of who some of these people are, because the UDT guys especially are pretty resident about their history from that point of view. And of course, this part of their history is such a small part of what they did. And some of them, of course, want to publicize that to some degree, but the vast majority of them don't too much. So for me, it's interesting to ferret some of these guys' names out and find out who they were, because I've got lots of photographs, but everyone focuses on these